Hello, everybody. Welcome back to the Taped Podcast, the most alien podcast in the world. We are your hosts, as always, myself, MickyT.
And me, Nostalgia.
And with us today, we have a returning guest who we haven't had on since the Mac DeMarco Worst to Best, actually. We have Otorio.
Been a while. Hello, how's everything been?
Hello,
We've
man.
been great. We've missed you, bud.
Right.
And making their debut on the Taped Podcast, fellow music critic and interviewer extraordinaire, we have BAZZREVIEWS.
Woo! I'm honored to be here. Thank you so much. Love the show. Love OutKast. It's funny, I'm actually wearing my Stanconia socks as we speak. I bought them from Stance. I don't know if y'all know that brand, but it's good.
Oh, hell yeah. Hell yeah. And you kind of spoiled it already, but like Baz said, today we are going to be doing a Worst to Best on one of the most iconic hip-hop duos of all time, OutKast.
Hell yeah.
This is very exciting. Andre and Big Boy, they've left us a very short but very impactful discography. We have 6 albums here. We're going to be including Idlewild. We're going to include everything from Southern Playalistic all the way up to Idlewild. And we're going to rank them from worst to best. So, with that in mind, y'all know the drill, and we'll get right into it. And we're just going to do a normal order that I introduced you in. So, Oscar, you can go before Baz. So, does that sound good?
Right.
That works.
All right, sweet. So, starting at our number 6 spots, in my opinion, OutKast's worst album is Idlewild.
I also went with Idlewild.
I went with Idlewild.
I also did Idlewild as well.
Hey.
Yeah, we're
I
in
think we can
unison.
all
Nobody
agree on that one.
surprised.
We can all agree.
No one's surprised. It's the obvious pick, honestly. And like any OutKast fan will tell you that Idlewild would probably be their worst project. And yeah, it's the 6th and final album in OutKast's discography, and it's also the soundtrack to the film of the same name. And while Idlewild is fine for what it is and seems like an alright backdrop to the film, it's not really that notable or memorable in OutKast's discography, and it kind of further emphasized Andre and Big Boy's waning chemistry as artists, because they were in completely different lanes. They had different musical ambitions, and if that wasn't already clear on Speakerbox to Love Below, then it's pretty clear on Idlewild, because they're barely on the same tracks most of the time. Idlewild, has some great songs, production, and features in its tracklist, but none of it really lives up to that OutKast standard or reaches the heights that the other albums did. In fact, a lot of it is pretty much just fine, but it doesn't go that extra mile. The sound of this thing remains in that kind of southern hip-hop and kind of pop soul-inspired lane that they explored on previous records, while they also throw in a little bit of musical, swing, jazz, and a few other things. It's cool to see the amount of eclectic sounds and ideas that still get thrown into the mix on an OutKast album, but it doesn't really have a lot of moments where it sounds incredible or sticks with me. In fact, it's underwhelming at times. Generally, I think features are pretty solid from Lil Wayne, Killer Mike, and Janelle Monáe especially. Big Boy and Andre sound fine over a lot of the production, but it's rare that they blow me away with their performances. And, it's disappointing that they're not really on a lot of the same tracks. They are in some cases, but they mostly aren't, and it was more than likely because of their creative and artistic differences. The cherry on top of it all is that it's bloated as hell with 25 tracks. So many of the songs just don't feel necessary or justify its length. It doesn't have a whole lot of replay value. As a whole, it just feels like an often half-baked mess with ideas that don't really have much that makes them impactful or interesting, and it sucks that this was the last official OutKast album. It has some great moments, but as a whole, it's just okay.
Yeah, as you said, I don't think the duo really left us off with any of their strongest material. I think that Idlewild, while it does have its moments and is a lot more theatric in its nature than a lot of their other projects, obviously because it is a film soundtrack, the quality of a lot of these tracks is just, in my opinion, very inconsistent. It tries to do a lot of things. It tries to mix a lot of genres and a lot of styles, but I think a lot of these tracks overall end up quite poorly conceived, quite half-baked, and the project just really ends up being one of their more average projects. It doesn't really have that many standout tracks. It does have some highlights, but aside from those, I don't think there's absolutely any reason why you should check out this project over pretty much anything else they've released. And as you said, it really does feel like the two have kind of drifted apart creatively. Nothing really clicks on this project as much as it does on their earlier works. And it's just a very average band in a very above average discography. A very average album in a very above average discography. My bad.
Alright. Idlewild is the final album from OutKast, of course, and it's by far their worst album. Nothing on here is like actually terrible or anything, but it's just nowhere near as good as other OutKast releases. It was made for a movie, so I'm not really surprised that they were a bit limited on what they were actually allowed. The production, a bit flat and boring, and doesn't really give Andre and Big Boy much to work with. They drift off artistically in this anyway. So I do like some songs on here, like When I Look in Your Eyes, which is basically a blues song, which is quite interesting. And a big problem is that this album's an album it did not be in, considering that the performances on here aren't actually that good. It's a bit bland and dry, nothing else really.
It's a bummer that I'm here last because it's like you guys basically summed up like almost all of my thoughts on the record. It's very long. It's really not sure of itself, and it is definitely a bummer that this was like the last album we got for them. It doesn't really call back to like what they've done in the past. It just feels like, to your point, guys, it's just like it's like part musical, part soul, part rap, and then it's just like it just doesn't work as an album. And also it was like it had its own like developmental hell for a long time. Like it was like constantly being delayed. It's just there was a lot of stuff that was going into this project. I feel like not as much effort was put into it, despite it being their final album. And I just wish that there was more here. I mean, there are some decent songs, like I think MickyT, Peaches, Morris Brown, Bugface, and Make No Sense at All are probably my favorite. But again, a lot of these tracks overstay their welcome. Like there's too many tracks, and I just wish that again, to think that like Andre 3000's gone almost 15 years without releasing a full-length album, and just to have this be like the last bit of music we've gotten from him other than like an occasional feature is definitely really sad. I mean, Big Boy's like, he's done okay with his rap career, but it's nothing that I'm really gonna like throw on like all the time.
And I could see that, yeah. I actually haven't heard many of Big Boy's other projects. I probably should.
They're pretty good. Sir Lucius Left Foot is all right. That was released in 2010. I don't know if you've heard that. And then I know, I think his most recent one was like 4 years ago. And I know he performed at like the Super Bowl halftime show, which was like kind of weird. Like he didn't really like fit in with like who else was performing there. But
yeah,
anyways,
true.
no, yeah, his rap career, it was all right. Like nothing like I would say is outstanding, but there are some like decent tracks here and there. I would definitely recommend For Your Sorrows. That's with I think George Clinton, who I know was featured on like a few of their albums in the past. There's another really good song with Gucci Mane too. It's called Shine Blockas. I would definitely recommend those two.
Yeah, I'll give those a listen whenever I can. With that in mind, moving on to our best and worst tracks, my favourite tracks from Idlewild are MickyT, Idlewild Blue, Hollywood Divorce, Call the Law, PJ and Rooster, and A Bad Note. My least favourite tracks are The Greatest Show on Earth, Dying to Live, Makes No Sense at All, Bugface, Morris Brown, and NTU.
My favorite tracks on Idlewild are MickyT, The Train, and In Your Dreams. My least favorite tracks are NTU, Makes No Sense at All, and PJ and Rooster.
My favourite tracks are When I Look in Your Eyes and Life is Like a Musical. Worst track is A Bad Note.
Wow, it was really a bummer to see somebody not like Morris Brown. That's honestly probably my favorite song from the record, but I just touched on mine a minute ago. Again, mine are my favorites are MickyT, Peaches, Morris Brown, Bugface, and Makes No Sense at All. And then my least favorite are Life is a Musical, Call the Law, PJ and Rooster, Greatest Show on Earth, and A Bad Note.
Okay, moving on to our number 5 picks. I chose Speakerbox, The Love Below.
I also chose Speakerbox, The Love Below.
I, in fact, chose Speakerbox, The Love Below.
I'm the outlier here. I chose Stanconia as my number 5 pick.
Yeah.
Oh. Same order.
Okay.
So.
Yeah, okay, same order. So, Speakerbox, The Love Below is a double album that OutKast put out at the height of their popularity. It's their widest selling album thanks to a lot of the incredibly popular tracks that was produced from this album, and it technically isn't an OutKast album at all. But instead, it's just like the first solo albums from Andre 3000 and Big Boy slapped together as a double album and packaged with OutKast's name on it. They both contribute in small ways to each other's respective sides, and while it certainly has issues, I think it's mostly enjoyable. Speakerboxxx and The Love Below are very different from each other, so I'm going to talk about them as individual albums, starting with Big Boy's side, Speakerboxxx, which is my personal favourite side of the album. It essentially sees Big Boy doing his thing over the same kind of production that we saw on albums like Stanconia, and while it certainly has moments that I feel like are Stanconia leftovers, I thought it was pretty enjoyable overall. The production was still very good, it sounds very rich, soulful, with its typical blends of hip-hop and R&B. It maintains a pretty cohesive sound, the features are great, and Big Boy stays consistent on each track. Sure, he doesn't really deliver on a lot of diverse verses, but he does well on his own and showed that he's capable of making great, catchy tracks on his own. And that's not to downplay what he does when he's with Andre, because quite frankly, I think they're equal. There's a few duds on Speakerboxxx, but there's plenty of fantastic tracks to its name, in my opinion at least. And The Love Below, on the other hand, is much more adventurous, as it sees Andre get into more eclectic, conceptual, and often experimental sounds. It takes influences that stem from many areas like pop, soul, jazz, space funk, electronica, drum and bass, and more. Three Stacks was so eclectic with his influences on this record, and I admire the ambition that was displayed. And even Andre mostly sings on this album as well, which is pretty interesting, and whenever he occasionally raps, I think he kills it. And I appreciate the concept he brought into it too. But, bit of a hot take, I don't really care that much for The Love Below. I honestly think it's a bit overrated, and it's a bit of a mess in my opinion. Now, that doesn't mean that I think it's bad, because it isn't. It has some tracks that are incredibly amazing and fun, that it's fucking stupid. But there's way too many ideas on this album that are interesting in concept, but get rendered as this boring idea that meanders way too long and gets stale after 3 minutes. These specific tracks drag on, and they are too much of a slog to sit through, in my opinion. I love plenty of tracks on this side to death, but god, I don't think that I would ever listen to it again in full. So, I guess in general, Speakerboxxx and Love Below is enjoyable. It's interesting to see what Big Boy and Andre would do in a solo setting, but it's not something I would personally listen to in full. Maybe I'd listen to Speakerboxxx in full, but I wouldn't listen to The Love Below in full. And I suppose this kind of signaled the beginning of the end for OutKast as well, because as much as Big Boy will reassure us that OutKast is everlasting and not clashing, it's clear that Andre and Big Boy weren't on the same creative page, and it shows. And yeah, that's just my piece on Speakerboxxx, The Love Below.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with a lot of what you said. I think this project, or double project, has some absolute gems, and particularly on Big Boy's side, Speakerboxxx. But clocking in at over 2 hours, more common than its highlights, are tracks that were honestly very forgettable to me, very unremarkable. A lot of the time they do feel like leftovers from the previous record, Stanconia. And as a whole, I think this album just kind of lacks identity in their discography. It feels like a bit of a mess. It feels like, two completely separate albums just kind of slapped together. It a lot of the time goes for a very accessible sound. A lot of the time it goes for something really out there. It doesn't quite know what it wants to be, I don't feel like. And, it's definitely their most demanding release when it comes to, a listening experience. It's not an easy album to sit through. That's not saying it's bad, it's just, 2 hours can get exhausting, especially when a lot of The Love Below, the second half of this album, just feels really underdeveloped to me. I think, Big Boy does what Big Boy's been doing. I don't think, if you're a fan of OutKast up to this point, I don't think there's anything disappointing about the first half. But the second half is, as you said, a lot more out there, a lot different. And, while it does have some great ideas, it has some, fantastic tracks, obviously, like Hey Ya. It's just very inconsistent. And with a record that's 2 hours long, inconsistency really matters, because it just becomes a bit of a struggle to sit through. And while, I do love a lot of tracks on here, I do think the album is, its greatest downfall is its inconsistency overall.
For an album that's 2 hours long, really, you have to be consistent. I find about 60% of both this is like combined. 60% of that is a bit filler. And yeah, I understand why they did 2 separate albums, like just to show what both members can do by themselves. Of course, this full album in general has the classics like Roses, Hey and The Way You Move. But like, there's nothing really else going for it. It's kind of boring, this album. It has some decent performances on both sides. I prefer Speakerbox to Love Below. But like, the Love Below has... It's probably like... I don't know how to put it. It kind of falls into like the trap of like trying to do too much. I mean, I understand Andre like experimenting with his sound and that, but like it doesn't really work. I just prefer more of the traditional tracks Big Boy produces. But yeah, I feel like at the tail end of the tail end of their career, they kind of ran out a bit of ideas and didn't really know what to do because they basically done it all already. But yeah, this album's too long, it's too inconsistent, and other than that, there's nothing really else to say.
All right, well, you'll hear my takes on that album later. You definitely gave me some interesting things to think about. But for me, at number 5, I have Stanconia, and I think this is honestly their most overrated work out of everything they've done. I think the first like 10 or so songs are like great, but the rest of it, I just feel like it's aged the worst out of everything they've done. Just really weird like instrumentals. Like I know like throughout their history, they've kind of explored genres that aren't just rap. They've done, again, funk, soul, electronic, like just so many different things, but I just don't think they really committed to that all the way on here. And I think the last, and they just like they feel like they're at their worst across the backstretch. Like this is like, it just doesn't feel like it's them. So yeah, I initially like thought this was their worst, like when I was like a few years ago when I was like a big OutKast fan. It definitely grew on me a little bit, but I still don't think it's like the amazing critical masterpiece that some people have made it out to be.
I mean, I can kind of see where you're coming from with that, but I mean, I guess I feel like the experiments on... Well, you'll hear my takes on Stanconia later on, but I feel like the experiments on Stanconia are probably some of their most rewarding, but that's just me. I mean, you'll hear my thoughts eventually, but I'm just going to put that out there.
For sure.
Yeah, my favorite tracks from Speakerbox to Love Below are Hey Ya, Roses, The Way You Move, War, Church, Flip Flop Rock, Last Call, Love Hater, Prototype, A Life in the Day of Benjamin Andre. And my least favorite tracks are Take Off Your Cool, Vibrate, Dracula's Wedding, Love and War, Pink and Blue, and Behold a Lady.
My favorite tracks on Speakerbox to Love Below are Ghetto Music, Unhappy, Church, Flip Flop Talk, Hey Ya, and Roses. My least favorite tracks are Love Hater and Pink and Blue.
My favourite tracks on Speakerbox to Love Below are Hey Ya, The Rooster, Last Call, Spread and Roses, and the worst tracks are Prototype and Love Hater.
My favorite tracks from Stanconia were Gasoline Dreams, So Fresh, So Clean, Miss Jackson, Snappin' and Trappin', Spaghetti Junction, Bombs Over Baghdad, and Slum Beautiful. And my least favorites were I'll Call Before You Come, Explosion, We Love These Hoes, and Humble Mumble. Some very interestingly named tracks on that record for sure.
Indeed. And moving on to our number 4 picks, I chose Southern Playalistic Cadillac Music.
I chose Stanconia.
I chose Southern Playlist Cadillac Music. Did I say that right?
Yeah.
No, you didn't.
Did you know?
Aw.
You kind of missed a small bit of it.
Oh.
Aw. Yeah, next time.
Yeah, it's definitely
say
a
it with
mouthful.
me. Say it with me. Southern Playalistic Cadillac Music.
Southern Playalistic Cadillac Music.
Hey, let's go.
Bravo.
All right, what was your pick, Bazz?
My pick was also Southern Playalistic Cadillac Music.
Should
Okay,
I go
wait,
last then?
Yeah, okay, you go last then. So you're the odd one out here. So, okay, OutKast's debut album came out during a time when the South was getting no critical respect in hip-hop, as most of the biggest and most acclaimed rappers were coming from the East and West Coast, and the South was pretty much just a running joke to them. And it wouldn't take long until OutKast themselves and many other artists in the South proved them wrong by birthing some of the most groundbreaking and creative albums and artists in the genre, OutKast included, but they didn't make that immediate step forward with their debut, since it isn't really Andre 3000 and Big Boy at their developed sound just yet. but I still think Southern Playalistic is a fantastic album. In fact, actually, Southern Playalistic sounds a lot like rappers from the East and West Coast. It takes a lot of inspiration from that lane, and that's a noticeable flaw for this record, but it isn't really much of a big deal though, since the album has some quality hip-hop to its name, and it's pretty damn great. While Andre 3000 and Big Boy are at their most unrefined on this record, they were still very talented at rapping and shared a great chemistry with one another. They had some very solid bars and verses throughout the record, a lot of which revolved around themes of living in the South. They showed that they were capable of creating some very sticky, catchy, and fun hooks, and in general, they added a lot of personality to the album. And that personality was also driven by a lot of the production, courtesy of Organized Noise. And while it doesn't have much of a distinct sound to OutKast, like I mentioned, it's still really damn great. The instrumentals on this album have this very vibrant bounce to them that play off of Andre and Big Boy fantastically. The sound is pretty diverse, with some tracks that take a few hints from G-Funk, Soul, West Coast and East Coast hip-hop, all while being put in this very layered, dense, rich and bouncy sound palette. And there were some fantastic instrumentals on this album that have aged incredibly well. It sounds so fresh, even to this day for me. There are some fantastic tracks throughout the album's duration that would probably rank among some of my favourite OutKast tracks. Some very memorable tracks that I've come back to a fair amount. I think the interludes are pretty good, and while it might have been a little long, it's still a fantastic debut from a duo that would end up doing much more creative and inventive things not too long after.
Am I going?
Yeah.
Now we're now on great OutKast tier here. The debut album from OutKast showcases some great production, performances from both members, and some great bars. This album is brilliant and showcases off old school rap music at its finest with some great lyrics. OutKast have some of their best songs on this album, with tracks such as Call of the Wild and Players Ball being some of my favourites from them. Production is smooth, relaxing, and at points sometimes hard-hitting. Flows are silky and clean and fit the production perfectly. The only problem with this album is it slightly drags on, but that isn't that bad, as I enjoy most of the songs that come from this album. This is a showcase of what OutKast can do, and of course it wasn't them hitting their full potential just yet, and this was just a start for greatness, really.
Yeah, all right. I'll go now. I mean, I don't really have like a lot of things to say that you guys haven't already. It is a really solid debut, some memorable songs. Again, great production from Organized Noise, some great lyrics. It all has aged pretty well, but I will agree with you, MickyT, that this is definitely a bit more unrefined, and I'm also gonna disagree with you here. I thought the interludes and like the skits, I think, like detracted from the album as a whole. Like I have never been a big proponent of having like a bazillion skits on a rap album. I think that'll probably be a future video idea of mine, like why I don't like them, why they don't really like work. But at any rate, this is still a really solid album that gave rise to not only the Atlanta hip-hop scene, but soon after you had the Memphis scene, the Houston scene, just like so many incredible southern cities probably looked at this album and were like, shit, why don't we have our own faces and have our own scene come up?
Yeah, I'm obviously the outlier here. I went with Stanconia, which I will mention at this point in my rankings is everything here is something that I would consider great. I think the duo only have really two albums that I don't really care for, and those are out of the way now. So now every project I'm talking about, I want to preface this by saying I do really like these projects. Stanconia contains some absolute highlights in the duo's discography, and as a whole, I think it's just brought down by a few duds, and this inconsistency is what ultimately ranks it below every other album that I've chose to rank above it. As a whole, I think this album is both a lot more accessible and fun natured than their first three projects, but at the same time it explores a lot of unique and interesting and experimental at times ideas, and this blend makes for some very bombastic tracks like So Fresh, So Clean, Bombs Over Baghdad's, and obviously Miss Jackson, one of the duo's most iconic tracks, and for a good reason. It's one of the most well written, one of the catchiest, and also one of the most introspective tracks the duo have ever released. Unfortunately, tracks like Toilet Tisha or I'll Call Before I Come just feel very poorly conceived, very just immature at times, and kind of drag down the album a little bit. But, it's still a great project, and it's definitely one that's worth checking out for any OutKast fan or any fan of Southern hip-hop or hip-hop overall. But, it's definitely the least consistent of the duo's 4 great albums.
Okay, my favourite tracks from Southern Playalistic Cadillac Music are Players Ball, Funky Ride, Ain't No Thang, Claimin' True, Get Up, Get Out, My Intro to Let You Know, and Southern Playalistic Cadillac Music. I don't really have a least favourite track, but if I had to pick, I would go with Deep and Crumbling Herb.
My favourite tracks from Southern Playlistic Cadillac Music is Call of the Wild, Players Ball, Hootie Hoo, Claiming True. If I was going to pick a worst track, I'd pick Get Up, Get Out, because it drags on a bit, but it's still a good track.
And then for me, my favorites were My Intro to Let You Know, Ain't No Thang, Get Up, Get Out, Funky Ride, and Deep. And my least favorite was the title track and Claimin' Tune.
My favorite tracks on Stanconia are Gasoline Dreams, So Fresh, So Clean, Miss Jackson, Spaghetti Junction, B.O.B., Humble Mumble, and Red Velvet. My least favorite tracks are I'll Call Before I Come and Toilet Tisha.
Alright, moving on to our number 3 picks. We're halfway through our rankings. I chose AOTY Aliens.
I chose who's got it?
I think me, right?
Yeah, go on.
Normal order.
I went with Southern Playalistic Cadillac Music.
I went Stanconia.
I went with AOTY Aliens as well.
Yo, let's go. Bazz,
We'll do Bazz after Mick then. Yeah.
Yeah. OutKast's sophomore album, AOTY Aliens, is one of the duo's most popular albums, and it's definitely easy to see why that's the case, because, to put it in layman's terms, shit fucking slaps. AOTY Aliens doesn't just stand out in OutKast's discography, but it stands out in the grander scheme of 90s hip-hop, as this album's sound is so unique to me. I can't think of any other 90s hip-hop album that sounds this minimal, nocturnal, and spacious. It sounds alien in that sense, and I think it's fantastic. The duo truly lived to the name OutKast in that respect, because, nothing sounded like this. Now, the production on AOTY Aliens is very stripped back and cerebral in contrast with Southern Playalistic, and to me, it only plays to Andre 3000 and Big Boy's strengths as rappers. Organized Noise also had a bit of hand in that production, and they did an amazing job, which pretty much with pretty much every low key and subtle beat on here, they don't disappoint in creating a sonic space that sounds immaculate from front to back. It has aged gracefully, and honestly, there are very few hip hop albums that manage to capture such a stripped back yet vibrant sound, unlike AOTY Aliens. Andre and Big Boy have only gotten better as MCs on AOTY Aliens. They already did a solid job in their debut and set themselves apart on a thematic front, but on here they take a totally different approach while adding to the themes that they explored on Southern Playalistic, as the lyrics on this record come off very conscious and introspective in juxtaposition with the gang-orientated and violent themes of other hip-hop artists at the time. And at the same time, Andre and Big Boy set themselves apart as distinct personalities on each track with their flows and style, but they definitely feel like a unit and a complementary duo. They managed to pull off some fantastic flows that feel distinct to them and create some very standout and fun bars while also being substantive in their song topics, my bad. If I were to complain about something, I suppose some lyrical moments like on Jazzy Bell haven't really aged that well. They feel kind of dated in my opinion. I don't know, the sentiment is there, but I don't know, the message behind those tracks just feels kind of dated in my opinion. And that's really it, because, put it bluntly, AOTY Aliens is a fantastic album and stands out as one of OutKast's best albums easily. It's incredibly simple yet unique, and it encapsulates a vibe unlike any other hip-hop record, and it honestly shows that the South really had something to say. Andre was right when he said that back in the day.
Yeah, absolutely. AOTY Aliens, it is really one of the most mellow hip-hop albums known to man. It feels kind of like it took a little bit more influence from the chopped and screwed scene from Houston and stuff, which I thought was really cool. And I think that was honestly the best part of the album, the production. I think it definitely trumps the lyricism here. Mick, you were just talking about some of the lyrical things haven't aged super well, and I will definitely agree with that. But again, the duo shows off pretty well in both areas. It's not like it's like a major complaint on my end. Um, but yeah, I think you pretty much encapsulated my thoughts on this record overall. I mean, it's really cool. It was interesting. I actually was reading a review, I think from like the Rolling Stones album guide, how someone was like the production isn't that great on here, but I have to disagree. To your point just a minute ago, you talked about how this was like, you know, one of the most unique sounding albums of the 1990s hip hop scene, and I would definitely agree with that as well. And it really only would work with Big Boy and Andre 3000. Just their voices and are just so memorable, and they work so well on all of these beats.
Who's going for?
Wait, we chose different ones, so we'll do normal order. I'll go first. I went with the duo's debut, Southern Playlistic Cadillac Music. And this is a fantastic project. It's not only an important moment in their career, but it's an insanely important album in putting the South on the hip hop map. Big Boy and Andre's performances and pen game throughout, while not as refined and not as memorable as on future releases, are still incredibly strong, incredibly iconic for a project recorded when the duo were still teenagers. And this is reflected a lot in the coming of age lyrical themes, and it's explored very well on this project. Instrumentally, I think the sound of this project takes a lot of influence from G-funk and gangster rap and incorporates it into a very, the now iconic sound of Southern hip hop, although it does kind of wear a lot of those non-Southern influences on its sleeve a lot of the time. It's very gritty, it's very playful. I think their instrumental sound would become more refined on future projects, and they'd be more confident in what they're doing. Because, as I said, the instrumentals here feel very playful. They don't feel that serious. They don't feel that refined, and they don't truly feel, to be uniquely OutKast. It's overall still a fantastic project. It doesn't quite live up to their best works, but for a debut album, it's incredibly strong.
The top 3 OutKast albums are interchangeable for me, but I do prefer the other 2 over Stanconia. This is the first album I ever heard from them, and it literally contains no bad songs. The album has great flows, great lyrics, great production. What else is there really to say? I enjoy literally every track on here. I'm impressed with what both members give for this album. For example, like Andre gives some fast and eccentric performances on tracks such as B.O.B. and Humble Mumble, whilst Big Boy gives us a bit more smooth flows, etc. So on tracks such as Snappin' and Trappin' as Miss Jackson. I think the album is near perfect and is one of the best hip hop albums of all time. Nothing else to say really, just a brilliant album. Just tell everyone to listen to it because it's proper good.
I will agree with you there. So, my favourite tracks from ATLians are ATLians, Mainstream, 13th Floor Growing Old, Two Dope Boys in a Cadillac, Elevators, Me and You, Over the Woods, Millennium, and E.T. My least favourite track is Wheels of Steel.
My favorite tracks were Two Dope Boys, ATLians, Jazzy Belle, Elevators, Over the Woods, and Mainstream. And my least favorite, Mickey, I'll agree with you there. Wheels of Steel was bad, and I also was not the biggest fan of either Babylon or Millennium.
I thought I was going to get some stick for putting Wheels of Steel in my least favourite tracks.
I just wasn't a fan of it. It just really, as a whole, just kind of fell flat for me, because I know it's like one of their, most iconic songs, but I just, I've never really understood the hype for it.
I don't fuck with the hook at all.
Oh,
no.
My favorite
sorry,
tracks
Oscar.
on their
Fucking
debut
hell.
are My Intro to Let You Know, Ain't No Thang, Southern Playlistic Cadillac Music, Players Ball, Deep, and my least favorite track is Funky Ride.
My favourite tracks on Stanconia are Snappin' and Trappin', Miss Jackson, Humble Mumble, Gangsta Shit, and B.O.B. And worst tracks is We Love These Hoops.
Alright, we're moving on to our number 2 picks now. And my number 2 pick is Stanconia.
My number 2 pick is Aquemini.
My number 2 pick is Atlian.
And my number 2 pick, much to the embarrassment of myself, is Speakerbox, Love Below.
Nothing to be embarrassed about, it's fine.
Well, I feel bad
And,
because you guys were like shitting on it at the beginning. I'm like, oh, like maybe
It isn't a bad album, it just isn't as good as their other ones.
I mean, obviously it's subjective, but it's interesting.
Well, absolutely. I get that, but yeah.
Yeah, but I'll be interested to hear your point of view anyway. And I think we'll just do a normal order. And I went with Stanconia. And Stanconia is a bit of a personal favourite of mine in OutKast discography. It was actually the first OutKast record that I listened to, and for a while it was the only OutKast album I ever heard. That definitely contributes to my love for this album, but also because the music speaks for itself and it kicks fucking ass in my opinion. Stanconia to me feels like a bit of a culmination between a lot of the ideas that the duo explored on their first 3 albums. Plenty of elements on Stanconia feel very vibe-heavy, funky, very much rooted in their southern hip-hop style, and the songs are just incredibly memorable and sticky. But the tone of this album finds a balance between the vibe and a direct punch, while Andre and Big Boy take this opportunity to experiment with some ideas that feel pop and rock-inspired, as well as ideas that are just straight up weird and experimental for the year 2000. And on that merit, it feels ahead of the curve. But then again, OutKast kind of already were with records like AOTY and Aquemini. The production on Stanconia is great, as you could expect on any OutKast album. The mixes are very crisp. The beats on this record are fantastic while being pretty distinct and diverse. They often feel very immediate and direct, while with little in the way of anything that feels off to me. And I think the album's embrace of a lot of pop and rock influences works to the album's advantage, since it's incredibly catchy and just fun as hell. And it just sounds incredible from front to back for me. Even some tracks that I don't think are amazing or feel a bit rudimentary in its beats still have fantastic qualities to them. Andre and Big Boy once again bring some incredibly fiery performances and stellar rapping to the table. They never really disappoint on that merit, and they each deliver some of the best verses they've ever laid to tape with some excellent chemistry. Even some of the best lyrical tracks that they've ever penned appear on this album in tracks like Miss Jackson, obviously, which was one of their huge pop hits. And whenever they aren't making topically focused tracks, they're just pumping out some fun and often hilarious verses that both display just fantastic writing and flows. Andre begins to sing a lot more here, and I think he sounds fantastic on that merit. The album features some great guest performances on some of my favourites on the duo's albums, actually, from basically Be Real of Cypress Hill, Gangsta Boo of 3 6 Mafia, Erykah Badu especially, Killer Mike, and pretty much everybody from Goody Mob. And the track list itself is very lengthy, of course, with well over 20 tracks, and it's padded out with a lot of interludes, and I can definitely see why the interludes might be an annoyance of listeners, and generally speaking, hip-hop skits back in the day felt lackluster, but honestly, I love the skits on Stanconia. I think they're full of personality. I think they're genuinely hilarious. They add a fair amount to the songs that would precede them. And in general, I just think they're great. And in general, I think that track list has some of my favourite OutKast songs and moments on it ever. Songs that I would rank among their best. And as I listen to it more and more, I grow to love it more and more. So yeah, I adore Stanconia. I think it's a fantastic album that I love listening to. It's one of OutKast's boldest albums and one of the most adventurous. And I think it's just an all-around banger fest.
I went with Aquemini as my number 2 pick. And I do have to mention that the gap between second and first place in this ranking is almost non-existent. Both are undeniable hip-hop classics and staples in southern hip-hop. But ultimately, it comes down to personal preference. And in my opinion, Aquemini is the group's second best album. That being said, I can definitely see why this is the album most people regard as the group's finest. And if I'm being honest, if I was to urge someone unfamiliar with the duo to listen to one project by them, I would likely direct them towards Aquemini. It's in a lot of ways the quintessential OutKast album. The production here has a lot of elements that make other OutKast albums great. It has the atmosphere of ATLiens, it has a lot of the playfulness of their debut, and it's, just an all-around really incredibly produced record with some of the best hip-hop instrumentals ever. And, as always, Big Boy and Andre deliver track after track with brilliant flows, incredibly well written and in-depth verses. And, a lot of their best performances show up on Aquemini. And also, it's very consistent. This album has pretty much no duds. There's only one below average track, and everything else is just mostly one classic on top of another. It's easily one of the group's best albums. It's easily one of the best hip-hop albums of the 90s. It's one of the best southern hip-hop albums. It's an absolute classic. I just prefer one album a little bit more.
Fair
This
enough.
album, at the end, is near perfect as well. It's the first sign of them like doing more storytelling tracks and see what they can bring lyrically to the table. They were good lyrically on their debut, but like they told way more stories on Atlian. And it's a fun album whilst keeping a conceptual tone. It is a great album, probably the most accessible OutKast album because they don't do anything too weird or experimental, or like they basically just stick to their root. Production doesn't really go as hard as certain tracks on Stanconia or even Southern Playlistic Cadillac music. But it has a low-key vibe, and I like that. I never thought Andre 2K can sound so cold on tracks on here. In
Did you
OutKast...
say 2K?
Oh, I'm an idiot. I apologise. I meant
I don't need to
3K.
apologise, I just thought that was funny.
I wrote that in my notes, and also wrote Wheels of Steak. Oh, I can't spell.
It's fine. It's fine, don't worry about it. I just thought it was funny.
Anyway, in OutKast's most popular songs, you see Andre as like this eccentric, awkward, and likable character. But on these tracks, such as Wheels of Steel and Over the Woods, you can see a colder version of Andre. This is my most listened to OutKast album, and I can just zone out listening to the chill vibe this album has. Doesn't really break any boundaries or anything, but it's still one of my favourite rap albums ever.
All right, here we go. The take that you guys have probably all been waiting for. It's funny enough, Speakerbox The Love Below used to actually be in my top 10 at one point. Again, keep in mind this was like when I was first getting into music. Like, you know, it was a pretty groundbreaking listen for me. I think, you know, after I re-listened to it, I think my views on it shifted a little bit. Again, I'll definitely agree. Grandiose production for the sake of it. But I think the reason I still love this so much is just based on nostalgia. Again, it was the first OutKast record I listened to in full. I remember so many of these songs from even when I was like back, like really, you know, young. Again, like Hey Ya, stuff like, I mean, I grew up with all those songs, you know, so it's just fun to, you know, re-listen to those and I still enjoy them today. And I think, again, I will definitely agree. It's hot and cold on both records. Each have some of the group's best songs and also some of the worst. And I think again, this has been a running trend from them, like throughout their whole career. I think all of their albums are pretty long, and this one is just like egregiously long. I will give you that. And also, I don't know who mentioned it earlier, but whoever talked about it, like, you know, marking the group's downfall, I'll definitely agree with you there. It was definitely disappointing not to see, you know, Big Boy and Andre like collab with each other more. It just felt like they were kind of just, again, not on the same page. They had their own direction they wanted to go with their album, which is fine, but, you know, it definitely was not like, you know, in the same vein as some of their other stuff.
Is that it?
That's all I got. That's all I got.
Okay. And with that in mind, my favourite tracks from Stanconia are Gasoline Dreams, Miss Jackson, I'll Call Before I Come, Bombs Over Baghdad, We Love These Hoes, Humble Mumble, Toilet Tissue, So Fresh So Clean, Explosion, and Slum Beautiful. My least favourite tracks are Red Velvet and Gangsta Shit.
My favourite tracks on Aquemini are Rosa Parks, Skewed on the Barbie, Aquemini, Synthesizer, Slump, West Savannah, The Art of Storytelling, Spotty, Oddie, Dopalicious, Y'all Scared, and Liberation. My least favourite track is Mamacita.
Wait, which version of The Art of Storytelling, part 1 or part 2? It's a big difference.
Both.
Okay, got it.
Yeah.
Include them together. All right.
Yeah.
My favourite tracks on Atlians are Over the Woods, Wheels of Steel, Jazzy Bell, Millennium, and E.T. Worst track is Wailing because it's far too short.
All right. So I guess I didn't touch on this in my original thoughts, but I think I definitely preferred The Love Below over Speakerbox. So I'll give my favorite from each record. Favorite from Speakerbox were Unhappy, Bowtie, The Way You Move, Bust, War, and Tomb of the Bone. And my least favorites were The Rooster, Church, Knowing, and Flip Flop Rock. Say that 5 times fast. And then my favorites from The Love Below were Love Hater, Happy Valentine's Day, She Lives in My Lap, Roses, Behold a Lady, and Love and War. And my least favorites were Pink and Blue, She's Alive, Dracula's Wedding, and Vibrate.
Okay, and we've made it to our number 1 picks. In my opinion, OutKast's best album is Aquemini.
I went with AT Aliens.
I went with Aquemini.
Woo!
I too went with It's Him and I, Aquemini.
Woo!
Whoa.
All right, you can go first then, Nostalgia.
Yeah, fair enough. Yeah, I went with the duo's debut, AT Aliens, which, as I said,
The
wasn't
debut?
exactly sophomore, Jesus Christ. This wasn't exactly a shoe-in for number one. Aquemini is a fantastic album, but for me, this album marginally takes the cake. There's a lot to talk about. I'll start with the duo's lyricism and performances. Lyrically, this project is certainly a lot more clever and refined and mature than their debut. A lot of the a lot of the lyrical themes admittedly aren't that great, but as a whole, I think the duo are really coming out of their shell here. They bring up a lot of introspective, a lot of serious topics, while remaining very mellow, very smooth in their delivery. Both Dre and Big Boy are on their A game throughout, delivering some of the most memorable verses in their career. Instrumentally, though, is where this project really shines for me. It's fantastically produced. It has a very, alien-like and almost unsettling atmosphere to it instrumentally, which, when mixed with Andre and Big Boy's very mellow, very focused verses, makes for an overall tone of just like pure atmosphere. It's a very dark album. It's in a lot of ways it sounds very cryptic, but at the same time it sounds very mellow. Sounds very what's the word? It doesn't sound discouraging. It sounds just very pleasant in its atmosphere. The instrumentals throughout are just so fulfilling to me. I think it's one of the best produced albums in hip hop history. There's not a lot that sounds like it, especially at the time. And overall, it's also the duo's most consistent album. It straight up does not have any duds. I think it doesn't really drop off in terms of quality at any point. And throughout the whole album, it's incredibly engaging. And the length of this album definitely feels a lot shorter than it is because of how smoothly it flies through its track listing.
All right, I went with the Aquemini, and OutKast's third album is always a popular pick for their best album, and I'm pretty much inclined to agree, in all honesty, as to me, Aquemini is the closest that OutKast have ever come to perfection, and in general, it's a phenomenal record to me. In terms of the sound, OutKast take a similar vibe-heavy and submersive approach that they presented on AT Aliens, but bring it into a setting that feels more dense and in line with inspirations from neo-soul and funk. They even brought in guest musicians to add some live instrumentation to the sound, and it gives this album an organic quality. They even made the recording sessions for this basically jam sessions. The production is layered with some incredibly rich textures and lush soundscapes. It sounds immaculate from front to back. It blows me away the more I listen to it. Even with more listens, I begin to get the perception that this is one of the best sounding hip-hop albums of the 90s, or dare I say ever made. The whole thing is just pure vibe, and I love it. Of course, we wouldn't really be talking about an OutKast record if not for Big Boy and Andre 3000, and they absolutely kill it on Aquemini. Lyrically and technically, they're both on their A game throughout the entire project, delivering some of their best verses, bars, and flows. Some of their best lyrical tracks turn up on this album, some of their strongest in the catalogue actually, including the title track, This Is the Art of Storytelling Part 1 and 2, Synthesizer, and many more. Even then, they just go over these relatively different kinds of themes, both of which Big Boy kind of sticks to lyrics that feel more conventional, whereas Andre tries to go over more abstract and poetic things. They create a dynamic while at the same time feeling unison. I think that the track list itself rarely has moments that feels underwhelming or subpar. It's consistently fantastic from front to back. And while I certainly feel like a few tracks don't really live up to the absolute best ones, they're still pretty great all in all, and for its production and performances. A criticism that I do have is that I feel like the record seems like one of those instances where I adore it, but it probably would be rare enough for me to listen to the entire thing regularly, despite it having consistently amazing moments, like the absolute best tracks, which I will get to. And I suppose the tracklist has moments like Liberation and Mamacita that kind of halt the flow of the album, whether it be because they're repetitive and or meander way too much. And like I mentioned, some of the features were fairly okay. And besides that, Aquemini is a very unique album, and it thrives in being a culmination of a fantastic vibe and killer rap performances. There's plenty of catchy, substantive, and sticky tracks, incredible production and performances, and it is, in my opinion, OutKast's best album.
Aquemini. In my opinion, I think this is a top 3 hip-hop album of all time. Everything about this just speaks to me as outstanding. I didn't hear a bad thing on this album or anything I even disliked. It has a great contrast of deep and darker songs. There's some fun and lively songs. The contrast is perfect, and I think this is one of the best written hip-hop albums of all time. This album is quite personal, and the OutKast boys blew me away with this album. The performances on the tracks are just brilliant. I think Android's verse on The Art of Storytelling, Part 1 is the best hip-hop verse ever recorded. The choruses are catchy, the flow's brilliant to listen to, and it combines all into one of the best albums of all time. OutKast Masterclass.
All right. And then for me, I think Aquemini took the best of both Southern Playlist of Cadillac Music and AT Aliens production-wise, but I think it's boosted with some of the strongest storytelling the group has ever done. And again, I'll agree with Mickey here. They are at their best in every sense of music. They're not afraid to dabble with a lot of different sounds. And, unlike Stanconia, which also had a similar vibe with like a lot of experimentation, I think it all really works. And it's not just a hip hop album. They have funk, soul, gospel, and even a little bit of rock influence on here, which is really cool. But I will definitely agree that the songs do sound a bit better on their own rather than like as a whole album, which I think is unlike anything they've really ever done, because most of their projects are pretty, consistent throughout. Like you could listen to the whole thing all the way through and it would sound really good. But I think here, just everything sounds good individually, which is cool. I think my biggest criticism was, again, a weaker ending. Some songs, are pretty questionably long. But I think, again, everything is made up for by the fact that the group is at their best. The production's at their best. There's just so much to like about this album. It's probably the closest album, maybe even someday this will be a 10, but it's the closest thing I can give to a 10.
Okay. My favourite tracks from Aquemini are Return of the G, Rosa Parks, Aquemini, Synthesizer, Slump, which is my favourite OutKast track, The Art of Storytelling Part 1 and 2, Spodioti Dopalicious, and Chonky Fire. If I had to pick a least favourite, it would be Mamacita.
My favourite tracks on AT Aliens are Two Dope Boys in a Cadillac, AT Aliens, Wheels of Steel, Jazzy Bell, Elevators, Me and You, Over the Woods, Babylon, Millennium, E.T., 13th Floor, Growing Old, and I do not have any least favourite tracks.
My favourite tracks on Aquemini is every song. I love every song equally. And the worst tracks, well, just none really.
All right, so my favorites from Aquemini were Rosa Parks, Scoot on the Barbie, Aquemini, Synthesizer. I actually preferred The Art of Storytelling Part 1 to Part 2. Slump, Liberation, and Chonky Fire, and my least favorites were Return of the Gangster, the aforementioned Art of Storytelling Part 2, and Mamacita.
Alright, we did it. We ranked every OutKast album. Woo! Give yourselves a round of applause there.
Sorry.
It's fine. Bazz and Oscar, thanks for coming on. We really appreciate it.
Absolutely.
No
Just
Thank
glad
you.
I could talk about one of my favorite hip-hop groups of all time with you guys. It meant a lot. Thank you for the time.
Yeah, we hope to
Yes.
have you back on soon, both of you.
Hell yeah. Just let me know
Yeah.
when, and I am 100% down.
Hell yeah. Hell yeah.
Yeah.
And I suppose we'll just end it off there. Thank you guys so much for checking out today's episode of the Taped Podcast. I really hope that you enjoyed. What were some of your favorite OutKast albums? Who did you agree with more? All of our links will be in the description to New Nostalgia's own individual channels, to Bazz's channel, to Otorio's channel, and to our individual album of the year and rate your music pages also. And with that in mind, my name's been MickyT.
I'm Nostalgia.
See ya!
Bye-bye.